IPMNation.com.
For no real estate developer, this is the music for the real estate there ever was. Living in the city, when you in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are just tired. These are the people in your neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right.
Good afternoon or evening, whatever you call 6 o'clock on a Friday. It is to you. My name is Dr. John Rich. It's our third installment of Dr. John's Neighborhood. I'm happy to be with you here today. I've been sick. I'll tell you, 2 weeks ago I got sick. You may have heard my first recording, and I sounded pretty stuffed up. And then last week's recording, I didn't sound nearly as stuffed up because I had been starting to get better. And then soon after that one, I got sick again. And so I've just been sick and then sick and then sick and then sick. Seems like it's going around. So I'm not completely better. If you hear me coughing in the middle of this, I apologize. But I'm well enough to come in here and record some things. I'm excited about the guest that we have in the second half hour of our 1 hour show. His name is Tom. He's asked me not to give his last name. His name is Tom. He is a retired Philadelphia police officer. And in the interest of learning about what life is like for people from different areas of society, I thought that would be interesting to talk to a former cop about what it's like to be a cop. Seems to me like it's pretty interesting job. You get to run into all different types of people, but then at the same time it seems like the types of people that you're going to run into on a daily basis are going to be people who are on the more troubled end of the spectrum, if you know what I'm saying. Nobody who's doing well calls up the cops. The only time you're calling up the cops is when there's a problem, and so you're just constantly in crisis mode, dealing with other people who are in crisis mode, and so it seems like it could be an interesting conversation. I guess we're going to find out. For this first half hour, I decided that I was going to talk about something that might seem a little tangential to the field of psychology, but in fact I think is intimately connected, and that's the issue of money. So I grew up in the suburbs of Pennsylvania, and for the first 9 years of my life, we were working class. I remember my father had a car. It was a nicer car, and we had a television, and we had, the kinds of things that you would expect people who were holding their heads above water would have in their house. And then at the age of 9, my father suffered from a breakdown. He became chronically depressed. I'm sure at some point when we start talking about fatherhood and how important fathers are to the family dynamic, I'll talk a little bit more about my father and that whole story. That has been a struggle for the ages, so they say. But my father became chronically depressed when I was 9, and it was kind of like a straw that broke the camel's back situation, in that he had a pretty horrific upbringing. His father was abusive, and his mother, turns out, was abusive, and he had a divorce where his wife had cheated on him before he met my mother, and all sorts of terrible things had happened to him. And then looking back on it, it just seems to me that my father may have had some kind of predisposition toward mental illness to begin with. So at the age of 9, when he was laid off from his job as a service manager at a car dealership, I think it was the last straw. It was just too much. I write some for a site called the Good Men Project, and on that site a lot of people talk about the myths of masculinity and how important it is to men to be masculine and to fulfill their role as men. in relationships, and one of the big areas where men feel pretty pressured to toe the line is with their income. I know that if I lost my job, I would probably be pretty depressed about it. It would be a pretty big blow. I feel proud of the fact that I can help my family pay its bills. My wife works as well, but I'm the primary breadwinner, and that's a source of pride for me, especially given the fact that after my father lost his job, things became a lot more tight. It was harder to pay the bills. I know that we were in debt. My parents tried to hide it from us, but we had to go into Section 8 housing, and we got something called food stamps. I don't know how many people out there are old enough to remember food stamps. I think nowadays it's called an EBT card. Excuse me. Basically, food stamps, you were allotted a certain amount of government-issued money to buy food at the supermarket. And they came in these books that they called food coupons. And even though they were rectangular and they were kind of the size of currency, they were clearly not currency. They came in a book, and you had to tear it out. They were perforated, and they came in different denominations. They had 1s and 5s and 10s and 20s, but the pictures were all like fluorescent purple and fluorescent pink. There was another one that was like a fluorescent green. So they weren't doing anything to help you hide the fact that you were poor. There were times as I became a little more self-aware that my parents would send me to the supermarket with some of those food coupons to buy some things, and I could almost hear the tearing of the perforation in the food coupon book reverberate throughout the store as, some kind of terror that the person at the checkout counter might get on the microphone and say, "Attention shoppers, we have a poor person here on aisle 5. Poor person here on aisle 5 tearing out his $10 food coupon. Anyone want to take a look and gawk, feel free to come forward." Of course, nobody did that, but it was pretty obvious. You don't pull out your wallet, and when you take out a $10 bill, you have to tear the perforated edges in order to give it to the cashier. And nor are there any bills that are fluorescent purple. Anyway, so became more noticeable to me that we were poor, and now that I'm at this stage of the game where my family is doing okay financially, we're not wealthy or anything, but we're paying our bills, that's a source of pride for me. So, that's my background, and I remember when I finally went to college after growing up on Section 8 and growing up using food coupons and growing up with the little whispered conversations out in the dining room about how are we going to pay our bills. Not to mention the fact that my father smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day and drank a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi every day. That surely didn't help the budget, right? I don't know what kind of budget out there is including that much money for cigarettes and soda, but it's not a wise one. So I remember that my mother in particular had a pretty strong message to me, which was that when I was graduating from high school, that I was going to go to college. She didn't care what I majored in. She didn't even care, she said, what kind of job I got after I got out of college. She said one time, "I don't care if you go to college and then you come out and you become a garbage man or you work at McDonald's, but you're going to go to college." She placed a high value on going to college. And I'm glad that she did, because when I got to college, I encountered people who didn't judge me for being poor. the way that I felt a lot of people in my middle school and high school did. I met a number of people because I started out at community college who were also poor, so that was nice to be around some people who understood. And I also encountered a lot of different ways of thinking about things. There's a particular moment in my early college years that I want to recount for you that really changed my life. I took a course that was called Intro to Business. In the community college curriculum, you had certain core courses, like any school does, and then there were electives available to you. I was a psychology major, but there were certain electives that I could take anywhere, and I decided that I was interested in taking a course about business. So I took the course, and one of the course requirements was that you had to investigate and research a company that was on the stock market. I wanted you to pick a company and then learn all about it and follow its stock price over the course of the semester, and then at the end make some predictions about what you think was going to happen with the company. Was it going to be successful? Was it going to stay flat? Did you think that it was going to fall apart, or whatever it was? So I picked a company. The company's name was Contel, C-O-N-T-E-L. It doesn't exist anymore, but you could probably Google it and find out a little bit about it. This would have been maybe 1987. That's my guess. And I investigated the company, and I soon learned that Contel, which was a telecommunications company, was going to be merging with, I can't remember what the other company was, but they were going to merge with a company that would expand the sectors where they would be able to do business. So I wrote in the report that I thought that Contel had a really bright future, that I expected that around the time of the merger, which was going to be in the next couple months, that there would probably be a rise in the stock price, and that anybody who had some extra money should invest. And I turned the paper in, and I remember thinking to myself, I've got some extra money to invest. I had been working for a long period of time. Prior to that, I actually started working when I was 11, delivering something called the Piggyback Shopper. It was like a newspaper with just ads in it. It wasn't any stories. It was just ads. It's called the Piggyback Shopper, and I delivered that once a week. And then I became a paper boy. And then I got some odd jobs being a camp counselor here and there. And then my first real job was as a cashier at Kmart. I was living with my parents. I didn't move out when I went to college. I stayed with my parents and drove to the community college. And then even after community college, I went to a local university and stayed at home and commuted. I didn't move out till I went to graduate school. So, where was I going with all this? Oh, so I had some money. Since I didn't have any real expenses in my life except for going out with my friends and maybe chipping in here and there to help my parents out, I was able to save some money. And I had just written this report about Contel, and I said to myself, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. The stock price was, I believe, somewhere around $34 a share. And I had $1,000, so I thought, well, that's enough for about 300 shares. I didn't really know anything about what I was doing, but I figured I could just go to a bank or something and figure out a way to invest in 300 shares of Contel. What's the worst that could happen? So there was this one day where I got up, and it was my plan to go and make this investment, and I was sitting in the living room with my father. He had made one of his rare appearances out of his bedroom to sit on the recliner. He didn't really do very much in those days. He asked me what I was doing that day. And I told him that I was planning on going to the bank and taking $1,000 out of the bank and investing it in a company called Contel. And my father said, "Who the hell's Contel?" And I explained to him, well, Contel is a telecommunications company, blah, blah, blah. Gave him all the details, told him about the assignment. Said that there was a merger coming. I thought that was going to be good for the company, and I wanted to try it out. And my father's message was that it was too risky, that stocks were for rich people, and that poor people like us were never going to get ahead, that there was something about the system that was meant to keep poor people down, that the system needed poor people, and that it was better to just be safe with your money and keep it somewhere where you would always know it would be, maybe even under a mattress. Don't trust any of these big companies because all they want to do is screw the poor. Well, that's my father, and he talked me out of the investment. I still tracked it, but I thought, okay, well, my father's older than I am, and it sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Maybe it's better not to take the risk. So I'm tracking it, and I'm especially tracking it as the merger is coming. And the merger comes, and it wasn't long before the price of the stock tripled. And I thought to myself, son of a bitch. Excuse me. But it was a valuable lesson because I realized that my father is giving me advice about money, and yet he has no money. And I realized that just generally in life, if you're going to take advice from somebody, it's probably better to take advice from people who have been successful in the area where they're giving you the advice. So if someone's giving you relationship advice, but they've been in and out of one bad relationship after another, maybe you take that information with a grain of salt. If you're talking with somebody who's poor about what to do with their money, I don't know that they really have the standing to be giving you that kind of advice. If you go to someone's house and they make you a meal, and when you eat it, you want to vomit, and then later on you're telling them about something that you're going to make, and they give you some advice about how you can make it taste more delicious, I'll bet you might listen to them and be polite and then decide not to do whatever it is they tell you to do. You just got to put more cumin in it. Anyway. So here was my father, and he talked me out of something, and I could have tripled my money, and I didn't like that. But the other thing that it did, in addition to teaching me a lesson about how to know whether to trust the source of the advice that you're receiving, is that it whetted my appetite for using my money to make more money. And this was, I had always been interested in money before. That's why I started working as early as I did. I had thought about money a lot when I was younger. Money was very important to me in a way that it seemed not to be important to other people in my family. I kept pretty quiet about my money situation and how much money I had, and just kind of kept on moving. But that experience really made me feel like some of those messages about the system wanting to keep poor people down and how poor people were never going to get ahead and how society needed poor people, I still understand those in the abstract, but as an individual, I came to see that those were not necessarily true messages, that I did have opportunities to take my money and make money. Now that right there, that was a message that my father gave me that I've found to be true, and that was that it takes money to make money. I've read plenty of books and articles by people who are trying to sell you a product, saying that you can get into real estate with no money down, or you can learn to become a successful writer or a speaker without having to put any money into it. But in reality, you've got to take some money and put it into some training, or use it, use it as leverage in order to get anywhere, especially in this kind of capitalistic country where we live. So, you need money to make money. So that kind of begged the question. I remember all of this. I'm remembering it out loud in order to express it in words, but I remember all of this happening all after I found out that merger had led that stock price to some pretty nice heights. I had regretted the decision that I made to follow my father's advice. But now that I realize that if I had done that, I would have tripled my money, it made me realize that there were opportunities out there to make money. What was going to be my best option for having money that I could use to then invest and make more money? And I realized that the secret, especially among people who are struggling financially, the secret is education. It sounds like a trope at this point. It sounds like something that people just say. But education is really almost the only path out of poverty for people who are starting out without some kind of trust fund to back up their dreams. I'm thinking about a boy who lives in my neighborhood. I'm not going to say his name. And he's been having trouble in school. And as a result of the trouble, his mother has pulled him out of school. And now she's homeschooling him. And I happen to know that most colleges and universities don't really value the homeschooling experiences when it comes to letting people into college. And this child, he's like 13, I think. He's not from a family that has any means. And I'm not sure if his mother is listening, and I hope that she doesn't take this the wrong way, but I really would urge her to get that boy back in school. He's a good person, and he's a good thinker when you're talking to him about topics that he cares about. The problem that he has is the focus and the fact that he has to learn things for which there's no apparent application. He needs to have teachers answer the question, why do I need to learn this? But I think the education system has more than just the goal of teaching content. The education system is not just teaching biological principles and mathematical formulas and grammatical rules and things like that. The education system is also trying to teach people how to think critically and how to evaluate different kinds of claims. It's also trying to put students in situations where they have to prioritize their time. They have to be able to take note of the social contexts that they have that are good for their self-esteem and for their aspirations as a student and for their career, and which of those social contexts might be fun but are actually distracting them from where they're trying to go. So, I realized that education was going to be where I really made my mark. And in fact, when I was in high school, I wasn't a very good student. I graduated with I think my GPA was a 2.02. That's certainly not anything to write home about. And mainly the reason is because I didn't care. Wasn't that interested. I grew up the way that I grew up. I suppose in reflection, I grew up with that message that my father had given me on that day when I was going to invest in the stocks, which is that there's not really anything that a poor person can do to avoid growing up poor. I've talked before about the intergenerational transmission of parenting practices. There's also something called the intergenerational transmission of poverty. And I can tell you that if you are not poor, the kinds of messages that poor people transmit to one another about how difficult it is to escape their circumstances are frequent and loud. I've come to think that to some degree they're self-protective, just like I talked about last week. If you think that you're not going to be able to escape poverty, then isn't it safer to conclude that the reason you're not going to be able to escape poverty is because the system's rigged against you than it is to decide that you're going to try to defy the odds and go for it? Because what if you go for it and you end up right where you thought you were going to end up? That probably feels worse than having some ready-made excuse to be able to back up why you didn't get where you were trying to go. Now, I'm not trying to deliver the message that if you're listening to me and you're poor, that it's your fault, although maybe it is. I'm trying to deliver the message that when people are in a hard situation and they're trying to break out, there are going to be an awful lot of voices that are trying to talk to you and whisper to you and raise their eyebrows at you in order to try to convince you not to take the risks, not to have the courage, that after all, there's nothing that you can do about it. But there is something that you can do about it, and poverty is pernicious in its negative effects. Poverty stresses people out, and in the research about being a parent with children, if you're poor, it's not good for your children, because the stress of being poor and worrying about the next eviction and worrying about how unsafe your neighborhood might be, worrying about paying the bills, etc., that stress gives you fewer emotional reserves to be able to handle your child in positive ways. When your kid gets on your nerves, you need to be the adult in the room and respond to it with communication that is level-headed and tries to get beneath some of the emotion that is being thrown out on the table to try to resolve it and help your child figure out a way to solve the problem or to come to some kind of compromise so that your relationship stays where it needs to be. But if a big part of your day is worry, and your kid comes and gets on your nerves, you know what's the easiest thing to do is just yell or ignore or hit. Being a positive parent is the hardest of the options that are out there. And poverty makes those very, very difficult to access. So, I actually intended at the beginning of this half hour to talk a little bit about some of the money strategies that I've used in my life, including real estate and some really strict budgeting practices. I guess I'm going to have to save those for next week because we need to take a break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk to my friend Tom, the retired Philadelphia police officer. Look forward to seeing you on the other side. IPMNation.com. And we're back, and I've actually moved my location here at the Dover Indoor Tennis Club in Dover, Delaware. I'm a tennis player. I don't think I've ever mentioned that, or at least I try to call myself a tennis player. Depends on how good you are. And the reason we're here is because I have a friend who works at this club. His name is Tom. We're just going to leave it at that. He prefers to just use his first name. And Tom is a retired police officer in a metropolitan area. And in the spirit of what this show is trying to do, which is talk to people who had interesting experiences and came from interesting walks of life, I decided that I was going to try to see if Tom would be willing to share some of his stories as a police officer. It occurs to me that being a police officer is a type of job that is unlike most others in that you wake up in the morning and put on your uniform, and you really don't know whether today might be the day that you get hurt or killed. That ever occur to you? Let's introduce Tom here.
Morning, John. Actually, you give it a little thought, but you kind of block it out of your mind all the time.
Okay.
Just you get a routine down, you just go out and do it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's important for everybody to do is whatever is happening, you can't stop doing it because of the anxieties you have. You have to plug away.
Right.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, like, how did you get involved in being a police officer? Like, did you have a dad who was a police officer, or how did you come to that decision?
No, actually, once I got out of the military in 1968, and I kicked around doing different jobs, driving a truck, driving a bus, and really didn't enjoy it too much.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of some of them jobs, I got laid off. And then have to, you're off for 3 months, and you go back for 6 weeks. You're laid off again. That got old. So I was basically looking for a steady job.
Right.
And police work is a steady job.
But I mean, that couldn't have come out of the blue, because you could have sold shoes or something.
I in the back of my head, I always admired policemen back then. Back then, police were admired, not so much today.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so what did you admire about people in the police force?
I don't know. I guess when I was growing up, I mostly seen them helping people. I didn't see, the things you see on TV were big shootouts and all that stuff, and it just appealed to me. And I figured I took the test and passed and got hired. And looking back on it, I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, we were talking before the show about what it was like to be a rookie police officer. It sounds like it's almost like being in a fraternity or something. Like there's a little bit of a period of time where you have to prove yourself to the people who have been around for a while. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, once I graduated from the academy and got sworn in and everything, I was assigned a police district. And upon arriving at the police district, I soon found out that they would ignore you. They wouldn't talk to you. They didn't know if you were internal affairs. They didn't know whether you just got off a spaceship. Or whatever.
Right.
And they just ignored you. And what they were doing, and I understand now, looking back on it, that they were feeling me out to see if I could do the job, basically. And until you prove yourself, you just have to go to work every day knowing you're going to be ignored.
Is there a high turnover in in the first year or two? Do a lot of people start and then they decide not to do it?
No, not really.
Oh, okay.
No, I didn't see a lot of turnover. Although the following year was the first year that they hired women, and some of them women were just nothing against women. I mean, I worked with some great women on the job, but a few of them they just weren't up to the they didn't like the job, and they went in different ways, different careers.
All right. You had a story about another guy who was a rookie. You were talking about how they treated you as a rookie in a certain way, where they were ignoring you and looking at you out of the side of their eye. And then 25 years later, you were doing the same thing to some of the rookies. But there's a particular rookie that you wanted to talk about.
Yes. this rookie was assigned to my district, and my lieutenant asked me to do him a favor. He says, "Can you show him the ropes for a week or two?" And I said, "Okay." So we went out. We're out there on routine patrol, and then we're actually sitting in this gas station one time, and a call comes out of a shooting at this intersection, which was 2 or 3 blocks away. And I should emphasize that this rookie was not like your average rookie. He couldn't wait to get involved in anything. I mean, just if a police call come out, he just would, hurry up, let's get to this location,
Most rookies are a little more hesitant to...
Yeah, most are just glad to be getting shown what's going on.
Right.
So we responded to this call of a shooting, and sure enough, we got to this intersection. There was 3 people that had been shot, and they were all laying in the middle of the intersection. They all appeared at the time to be deceased. So what happened is I explained to them, I says, what we're going to do, first thing we do, you contact the division, police radio, and you let everybody know what you have so they can set up a crime scene and everything, right? And then what I did, I don't even know if they do this nowadays. I got my briefcase, and we assumed that they were deceased. And it turns out it was a little mistake on my part.
All right.
Because I started chalking a body.
Uh-oh.
Right? And this rookie also starts chalking one, but the one he's chalking, the person who was shot opens his eyes, looks at the rookie, and says, "I'm not dead."
Right.
And the rookie, who in turn looks at him and says, you will be.
We're actually recording a radio show right now.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
So, he's chalking this body, and the person opens his eyes and says, "I'm not dead." And the rookie looks down at him and says, "You will be." He turned out to be right, because a minute later,
he was bleeding.
He didn't make it. But I said to myself, where did I get this kid from?
Right.
Yeah. But he was one of the million. I look back on it now. He turned out to be a good cop, but he was a little rambunctious in the beginning.
You think that he's still in the police force, right?
Last I heard, he was still on the job. Maybe now he might be off. 6 or 7 years ago, I know he was still on the job. I don't know what he's doing now.
So something that you said that I didn't think we were going to be talking about, but you mentioned it, and I think it would be interesting, is you said that you were going to go out on routine patrol. So take us through that. Like, let's say, okay, you come in that day, and they say, go out and do a routine patrol. So what is that? What does that look like?
Well, you're assigned a sector, and that's your responsibility. In my case, I worked a paddy wagon for most of my time, and we had the whole district to patrol, but each car had a separate sector that you were responsible for, a 4 or 5 block square area,
Okay.
And you learn to know the people in that area, the people that had the stores. You be first name basis. They knew you knew them, and if something was out of the ordinary, you could react to it. But routine patrol basically is just being ready for something if something comes down the pike. A routine day can be the most boring day in your life, and on another day, it can be boring up to a certain point, and then you just go through stuff that you can't imagine,
right?
That you would ever see or witness or anything like that. So I'll say one thing about police work: it's different every day. I never worked a day that was the same as the day before.
Yeah,
it just didn't happen.
Well, that's why I thought it would be interesting to talk with someone who was a police officer, because so I'm a professor. My day is I go in, I prepare some lectures, I go and teach some concepts to people. maybe I do some writing or I go to a couple meetings. That's my day. At no point am I expecting that I'm going to run into a body or someone's going to try to shoot me or someone is going to yell some kind of profanity at me or get upset.
Right.
I'm highly respected in my job, and I don't have any worry about my mortality or about the kinds of things I'm going to get exposed to. So I told you I was going to ask you this. So let's say we have a 20-year-old and he comes to you for some reason and says, I'm thinking of becoming a police officer, and he's looking for your advice. What might you say to this person?
Nowadays, as compared to when I came on, I would tell him to seriously take a good look before you jump into that business.
Okay, so what's the difference? That implies that you wouldn't have given that advice to that 20-year-old back in 1968.
Right. That's correct.
So let's do that. Let's take the 20-year-old and move him in a time machine.
Okay.
And now he's coming to you back in the mid-70s, and he says he wants to be a police officer. Would you be a lot more encouraging at that time?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so what's the difference between 2018 and 1975 in terms of how much you would encourage somebody to enter the field?
Well, nowadays, in my eyes, I mean, I don't believe the police are respected today. I think they're. If you look at a lot of the incidents you see on television nowadays, where there's controversies involving police and everything, in my eyes, it usually comes down to the point where the police gave somebody an order, either to put your hands up or do something, and the person did refuse, and it got out of control. That's just the way it is today. That's the way I look at it.
Okay. So you think that back in the 70s, if a police officer gave an order, that most people would just do whatever the police officer said, and now you're maybe more likely to run into some resistance?
Absolutely.
Okay. And is any of that warranted, do you think? Do you think there's anything about...
Well, the way I look at it is, if a policeman says, do something, first of all, do it, because you're going to have a chance to either prove that the policeman was wrong or he was right. You're going to have your day in court. But to stand and resist is not the way to go.
Right. Well, I don't know that I want to touch on some of the stories out there about people who got put in a police car and then they end up getting shot or whatever under mysterious circumstances.
Listen, there's bad apples, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I'm going to tell you the majority, the police go to work every day and plan on doing a good job.
Right. I mean, it sounds like your story, that the reason you wanted to get into it is because you wanted to help. There was like an altruistic reason that you wanted to be a police officer.
Right.
And you think most people are like that they're...
Absolutely.
They feel like they're going to contribute to society. They're going to...
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. There's a story that you said you wanted to tell, and I'll warn my listeners that you said that it had like a gruesome quality to it, but I don't think my listeners are going to do anything with that information than pay closer attention. That makes for good radio. So tell me about this story that you wrote on this piece of paper. You wrote Screwdriver. What is that?
Yeah. Me and my partner were on patrol, and the call came out of a disturbance with injuries. So we were only a few minutes away. We responded to that location, and it was a street with row homes. And when we pulled down the street to the location that we were given by police radio, if you're familiar with these big city streets, when driving down the street, when you come to the location, you walk out of the house, there was steps, but it had a cement surrounding that went down to the pavement. You could use it for a handrail.
Okay.
But you couldn't see the steps.
So it's not like a rail where you can see through the rail. What's happening It's blocking your vision. Is that important to the story?
Yes, it's blocking the vision.
Okay.
So we pulled up to the location. The front door was open. And as me and my partner got out onto the sidewalk and got to the steps to go into the house, there was this woman laying on the steps that I'm not exaggerating, her head was the size of a watermelon, severely beaten.
Oh.
And my partner and I looked at each other and we said, this woman's deceased. That's how bad she was beaten. Turned out she wasn't dead.
She's lying.
She's lying on the steps, not moving, bleeding profusely, and her head was just the size of a watermelon. Now we had to clear the house, so when we got up to the top of the steps to enter through the front door, I see this elderly woman sitting. She was, if you can picture an Indian sitting in a teepee, the way he sits.
Okay.
This woman was sitting there with her hands on her head with a screwdriver sticking out the top of her head.
Whoa.
And she was saying, to me, I don't know how she could speak, but she's going, baby Jesus, baby Jesus. And there was brain matter coming through her fingers and hitting the floor. So my partner go in, we look at each other and say, oh my God. We went up to the woman, we said, you'll be okay, you'll be okay. We didn't know what else to say.
Yeah, she probably wasn't going to be okay. Right?
She didn't make it, by the way. But we still had to clear the house, so we had to go through to see if the perpetrator was still inside. After we cleared the house, well, we called for rescue on the way to clearing the house. But after we do that, we come back. Rescue was there. They got her. She was still alive the last time I seen her, but she didn't make it. But to make a long story short, what happened was I found out at the trial was that her nephew, who was he was a junkie, right? He was over his aunt's house. The aunt was the one with the screwdriver.
Okay.
And the other woman laying on the steps, they were having a Bible study when the nephew comes home and he wants some money for drugs. And she says no. So he went down in the basement, got a screwdriver, come up and did what he did to the woman. Right? He wasn't on the scene at the time. And
then he did something to the other woman too.
Yeah, I believe it was a chair leg he took to her or something like that. I'm going back into a lot of years.
Yeah.
But I do remember at the trial, they locked him up about 2 or 3 weeks later, and about a year later, I guess it was, we go to trial. And he was convicted, but this is ironic about this. I had testified that day, but when you're done testifying, the district attorney signs your court notice, and you're done. So I hopped on transportation, and I went home. And that night, I'm watching television with my wife, and the newscaster says this person was convicted, and upon hearing he was convicted, hopped out of his seat, went over to the window at City Hall, jumped out the window, and impaled himself on a fence that surrounded the City Hall. And he survived, and I believe he never walked again. I know he spent if he's still alive, he survived that. He went to jail as a cripple. I know that. But that case right there sticks in my mind. Like looking at that woman when we went into the house, and I felt so helpless that I said I don't know what to do for this woman.
Yeah.
But just something that sticks with me to this day. That's about that.
Yeah. It reminds me of stories that I've heard from people who were military, in that, they go into a situation and they see somebody who's been disfigured or somebody who's been shot or just traumatic experiences that are a part of what it's like to be in Afghanistan or Iraq, or in this case, on your beat. So I remember asking you before the show whether you thought that police officers had to deal with things like PTSD, and you didn't seem to think that that was really an issue. But I don't know how it couldn't be. How can a person go and see someone with a screwdriver sticking out of her head, see a woman who's been beaten so severely, you've got an altruistic sense about yourself, and you want to help, and yet here's a situation where you can't help. You say that you still think about these. They're like flashbacks of this or whatever. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? It seems like that is part of the job that this 20-year-old needs to be told, is that you're going to experience things that are not a part of what most people experience.
Yeah. As police, we always see the bad side of society, and you just have to, you just adjust yourself to say, well, yes, this is bad. This is really bad. But you just have to keep going, and down the line there's going to be something else that's going to catch your, stick in your craw.
Right. Yeah. Well, it seems to me like you have to be a special kind of person or a certain kind of person to be able to brush off experiences like that. So do you think that in order to be a successful police officer, you have to have a certain kind of personality?
I believe you do.
Yeah?
I really do.
Like what? What kinds of characteristics should a person have to be able to handle experiences like that?
You have to tell yourself that this is really nasty, what I'm experiencing now, but there's probably something out there even worse.
Even worse. That's the
that sounds
advice.
That sounds
that's
crazy, but that's what gets you through.
Wow.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that were in my profession that seem a lot worse than what I just was talking about.
Right. Yeah. So just kind of like a mental toughness or whatever. You talked about how police officers use what I labeled gallows humor. That they have they have jokes to try to smooth over some of the difficulty of the job. So tell us that story, the one about lunch.
Yeah, like I say earlier, working up a paddy wagon, our main job is to handle disturbances because you're a two-person team, and hauling bodies is one of the major things. If someone gets involved in a bad auto accident or whatever, get them to the hospital. If they wind up, they don't make it. The paddy wagon is the one that's going to get them to the ME to find out what happened. So me and my partner, this would happen a lot. We would, put the body in a stretcher, get it down to medical examiner, and not jokingly, but when we're done, we'd say to each other, "Well, I don't know about you, but I'm about ready for lunch." And that's just, it was normal,
right?
To leave a place like that and just go out and get lunch.
Huh. Yeah.
Sounds crazy, but it's true.
Now, I remember one person saying, a person in my past, talking about people who, criticize the police, and that sometimes the retort is, well, if you were going to take over, let's say you're going to take over the government, you're going to need to have a group of people who are enforcing your laws. You might have different laws than the law. You don't think that the way the government is set up is proper. You have this other idea of how things should be structured. But even if you got your way and you're going to structure things differently, you're still going to have a group of people who are going to enforce your new idea. And so, in spite of the fact that we keep hearing about police officers who maybe don't control themselves the way that they need to control themselves, or have biases that are playing out against certain communities disproportionately, I imagine as a psychologist, like in any field, that the vast majority of people who do the job mean well and
Absolutely.
aren't going about it in order to be corrupt. And yet the corruption is there, and it affects people in a pretty powerful way. Well, so we're actually running out of time, which is ridiculous. Like every time I start a conversation, I wonder whether we're going to fill the time, and then we end up in this very spot here where we're running out. So any last words for people to know about police officers or this 20-year-old that we were talking about, something to wrap it all up?
Well, every day that I went to work and stood a roll call and got ready to go on the street, I never, ever once worked with a police officer that was going out the street to harm people or do people bad.
All right. Great. Well, it was a pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad. I know when I first brought up the idea, you weren't sure that you were going to be interesting, or you weren't sure that you were going to be able to do an interview. You hadn't done anything like this before, but I had a really interesting time, and now I know you a lot more than I did before.
That's for sure.
Up until now, you're just the guy who lets me onto the tennis court when it's my turn to hit the ball into the net. So thanks for sharing with us.
I enjoyed
really
it.
Appreciate it.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Talk to you next week.
Living in a city, when you're in it, watch the people walk by. And if you listen real close, you can hear them talk about their lives. And some hate it, some love it, some are just tired. These are the people in the neighborhood, they just trying to make it out right. See, she never...
IPMNation.com